Scientists finally opened the Sumerian handbag of gods. Mind-disturbing. There is a stone carving in northern Iraq that has been quietly breaking the internet for the last few years. A winged man, muscular, bearded, dressed like a king's bodyguard, standing guard on a palace wall that is nearly 3,000 years old. In one hand, he holds something shaped like a pine cone. In the other, hanging at his side like he just walked out of a shopping mall, is a bag. A rigid handle, a squared, boxy body. The exact silhouette of a handbag you could buy today. And the strange part is, that same shape shows up again and again on a stone pillar in Turkey that predates farming itself, and on a carved monument in Mexico, on a continent that supposedly had zero contact with the Middle East. 3 cultures. 3 continents. Thousands of years apart. The same object in every single one. So, what actually is it, and did anyone ever find out what was inside? Let's start with where this image actually comes from, because most people who share it online have no idea. The carving is from the ancient city of Nimrud, in what is now northern Iraq. Nimrud was one of the great capitals of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and around 880 BC, a king named Ashurnasirpal II built a palace there that was designed to intimidate anyone who walked through its doors. The walls of the throne room were lined with massive slabs of pale stone, carved in relief, once painted in vivid color that has long since worn away. If you were an ambassador or a defeated governor being marched in to beg for your life, you would pass row after row of these carved figures before you ever reach the king. The figures are not ordinary humans. They are broad-shouldered, winged, dressed in elaborate fringed robes, some wearing horned caps, some with the heads of eagles instead of men. In Mesopotamian tradition, these beings were called the Apkallu, ancient sages said to have existed before the Great Flood, credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization itself. On the palace walls, they were not decoration. They were protection. Guardians standing at doorways and thresholds, the exact points where the Assyrians believed evil was most likely to slip into a space. And in the hand of many of these Apkallu figures is the object the internet now calls the handbag of the gods. Here is the detail almost nobody mentions when they share the image. Look at the other hand. Because in nearly every one of these carvings, the free hand isn't just resting. It's raised, holding a small cone-shaped object, and it's angled toward something, usually a stylized tree made of interlocking branches that scholars simply call the sacred tree, or sometimes toward the king himself. That pairing, a container in one hand and a small raised object in the other, is not random. It is a gesture. And once you notice the gesture, the whole picture changes. Because the Assyrians did not leave this a mystery. They wrote about their own rituals extensively, on clay tablets, in temple records, in texts describing exactly what their priests did and why. The container is generally identified by scholars as a bucket, what would have held water or a ritual liquid. The cone-shaped object, in the other hand, functioned like a sprinkler or an aspergillum, the same basic tool a priest might use even today to flick holy water over a congregation. The gesture carved into the walls of Nimrud is a purification ritual. Bucket in one hand, sprinkler in the other, cleansing the sacred tree, the king, the doorway, the room. When residue has been recovered from surviving bronze buckets of similar design from Assyrian and earlier Mesopotamian sites, what shows up is consistent with water and plant matter, not some unidentifiable substance, not evidence of forbidden knowledge or hidden technology. In other words, the bag was never sealed. It was never meant to be opened like a container full of secrets. It was a tool in constant, visible use, carved into the wall precisely because everyone who saw it already knew exactly what it was for. So that closes the case in Assyria pretty cleanly. But it doesn't explain why the same shape turns up somewhere it has absolutely no business being. Travel about 500 miles northwest of Nimrud, up into the hills of southeastern Turkey, and you reach a site called Göbekli Tepe. This place is old in a way that is genuinely hard to process. The oldest structures date back to roughly 9,600 BCE, which means we are talking about 11,500 years before the present day. This was built by hunter-gatherers, people who had no writing, no farming yet, no metal tools, no wheel. And yet they quarried, moved, and raised massive carved limestone pillars, arranging them into rings and covering them with detailed animal carvings, foxes, boars, vultures, snakes, scorpions. On one particular pillar at the site, known to archaeologists as Pillar 43, sometimes nicknamed the vulture stone because of its dense imagery of birds of prey, there is a row of small carved shapes near the top. Squared bodies. Arched handles. To modern eyes trained by the Assyrian image, they look exactly like handbags, sitting in a row of 3 above a scene full of vultures and scorpions that researchers still debate the meaning of. Sit with the math for a second, because this is the part that makes the mystery feel so genuinely strange. The gap between Göbekli Tepe and the Assyrian palace carvings is around 7,000 years. That is a longer stretch of time than separates those Assyrian carvings from us, right now, today. When Göbekli Tepe was built, there was no Assyria. There was no Sumer. Writing had not been invented. Cities did not exist yet. There is no plausible chain of trade routes, no shared language, no record of contact that could carry a specific visual idea across that much time. And yet, there the shape is twice, thousands of years apart, with what looks like the same silhouette. Then the shape shows up a third time, and this time it crosses an ocean. In the Mexican state of Tabasco, at a site called La Venta, archaeologists have uncovered monuments left by the Olmec, generally regarded as the earliest major civilization in Mesoamerica, the culture that came before the Maya and the Aztec and left behind the famous colossal stone heads. La Venta flourished sometime between roughly 1200 and 400 BCE, overlapping in part with the era of the Assyrian palace. Among its carved monuments is one catalogued as Monument 19, showing a seated human figure wrapped inside the coiled body of a large serpent, its open mouth arching over the man's head like a hood. And in that seated figure's hand is an object with a rigid arched handle over a squared base. The same basic shape again, on a continent that, according to the mainstream archaeological record, had no contact whatsoever with the ancient Near East. Once people notice this pattern, they start finding it everywhere, and it's worth being honest about that because it's part of how this mystery grew online. Some point to Maori oral tradition and the story of Tawaki, a figure who ascends into the sky and returns carrying baskets containing sacred knowledge. Some point to an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic sign, a squared shape with a dome top, used to represent a shrine or the dwelling place of a god. Line all of these examples up side by side: a pillar from before farming, a palace wall from Iraq, a serpent monument from Mexico, an oral tradition from the Pacific, a symbol from Egypt, and it becomes genuinely difficult to unsee the pattern. That difficulty is exactly why the idea of a lost global civilization, or something even further outside the mainstream, visitors who arrived from somewhere beyond the sky and left behind fragments of a shared symbol, has so much pull. It takes the coincidence seriously instead of shrugging it off. But before that theory can stand, it has to survive an obvious question, and it's a question worth actually asking on camera rather than skipping past. If a single civilization, whether human or something else entirely, really did span the globe and teach every culture the same sacred object, why is the handbag almost the only thing they supposedly left behind? Real contact between cultures is never that clean. When people actually trade and communicate across long distances, they exchange far more than one shape. They swap words, crops, diseases, techniques, gods, calendars, units of measurement. Archaeologists can trace real ancient contact through exactly that kind of mess: shared vocabulary, matching technology, overlapping trade goods. A civilization that supposedly circled the planet and left behind exactly one consistent image and nothing else doesn't really behave like a civilization. It behaves like a shape that kept getting reinvented. And that reinvention has a boring, very human explanation, which is honestly the more satisfying answer once you sit with it. Think about the actual physical problem being solved. You need to carry liquid or small objects from one place to another. You want a container with enough volume to be useful. You want a flat base so it can be set down and stand upright without spilling. And you want a handle that arches above the body so your hand can grip it without touching whatever is inside. Square or rounded body, flat base, arched handle rising above it. That is close to the most efficient shape available for solving that exact problem with the materials and tools available to a Bronze Age craftsman, or for that matter a hunter-gatherer 11,000 years ago. It is the same reason completely unconnected cultures across the world independently invented the pot, the needle, the bow and arrow, and eventually the wheel. When different peoples face the same basic practical problem, their solutions tend to converge, even with zero contact between them, because there are only so many efficient ways to solve it. Once you separate the shape from its meaning, the parallels actually start to look a lot less mysterious. The Assyrian object sits inside a documented ritual, paired with a specific companion object, appearing at doorways and thresholds, with a plausible identification as a bucket and sprinkler used in a purification ceremony that Mesopotamian texts describe independently of the carvings. The Olmec object at La Venta sits inside its own separate mythological world, one of serpents, rain, and Mesoamerican deities that owes nothing to Mesopotamia. Nothing in the archaeological record connects the two beyond the outline. And the Egyptian shrine symbol has its own well-documented meaning within Egyptian religious writing, developed entirely within its own tradition. Which brings us to Göbekli Tepe, and this is where an honest version of this story has to slow down instead of rushing to a tidy conclusion. Pillar 43 really is that old. It really does predate writing, farming, and cities by thousands of years. And there is no accompanying text, no scribe, no inscription anywhere at the site that tells us what those three small shapes above the vultures and scorpions actually meant to the people who carved them. We can reasonably say that people capable of carving detailed animal reliefs were also capable of independently carving a handled container because it is not a complicated shape. What we genuinely cannot say, with any confidence, is whether it meant anything close to what the same silhouette meant to a priest in Assyria 7,000 years later. On that specific pillar, the honest scientific answer is that the meaning is simply unknown, and any documentary that tells you otherwise, that claims a lab finally cracked the code or found alien residue inside a carving, is not describing real archaeology. You cannot open a carving. There has never been a physical Sumerian handbag recovered from the ground. Every version of this object that exists is a two-dimensional image carved or painted onto stone, not a container anyone has ever actually opened. So where does that leave the mystery, now that we've actually looked at both hands instead of just the one holding the eye-catching shape? In Assyria, the case is about as solved as ancient history ever gets. It's a bucket and a ritual sprinkler, used in a purification ceremony that the Assyrians themselves wrote about, carved into the walls of a palace built to project protection and power over a king who needed both. The apparent echoes in Olmec, Mexico, and ancient Egypt are most likely the fingerprint of a genuinely useful shape being reinvented by different cultures solving the same practical problem in their own separate contexts, not evidence of contact or a shared origin. And on a hillside in southern Turkey, older than history itself, sits one carving that we honestly cannot fully explain yet, not because the truth is being hidden, but because the people who carved it left us no words to go with the image, and archaeology, done properly, doesn't get to invent an answer just because the silence is uncomfortable. Maybe that is the more unsettling ending if you think about it. Not a global lost civilization. Not visitors from beyond the sky. Just proof that human beings, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, kept arriving at the exact same simple, elegant solution to an ordinary problem, over and over again, without ever needing to meet. And one carving old enough to remember a world before farming, still sitting there, quietly keeping it secret. So here's what I want to know from you. Out of everything in this video, the Assyrian bucket, the Turkish pillar, the Olmec serpent stone, which one do you think is genuinely connected to the others, and which one do you think we've just been pattern matching onto for no real reason? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more stories where the real explanation turns out to be stranger and more human than the myth, subscribe, because the next mystery we dig into has been sitting in plain sight even longer than this one.